Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to be covering two topics. The first one is going to be the ongoing anti-government demonstrations in Central Europe. And the second one, since this is the 50th edition of the show, we're going to be doing a little bit of reflection on the importance of the freedom of the press and the concept of freedom and what that means in the Armenian context. Let's move on to this week's protests. These protests started, or the reason for starting them by the opposition was the change in rhetoric on the government's position in regards to the status of the Republic of Artsakh and its ongoing international negotiations. Let's talk about the size of these demonstrations. I would say that since the post-revolutionary period, these are probably the largest demonstrations that we've had in Armenia. The largest days, the largest crowds was the day when former President Kocharyan was speaking, when we probably had somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 people. On a normal day, you will see something from a couple of hundred people to these nightly rallies that bring a couple of thousand people. So these are large and substantive, but they are not anywhere close to what we have seen in Armenia in the past, especially during the revolutionary period. Now let's go hear what some of these protesters have to say about the reasons that they're out in the streets.
This is a decisive moment that every Armenian must be here in order to really protect, defend our country. We are in a very difficult period that every Armenian must understand and must explain to the other Armenian that everything is dependent on us.
We expect a peaceful resignation process. And for me personally, it is a fight for an eternal Armenia, for values that I truly believe in. I guess we reached the point where there is no way back. We cannot stop at this stage because we're gonna lose the country that we still have, the independence, the values that Armenian people truly believe in.
Here people should do the most that from their power to take out this Armenian speaking Turkish Nazi power who is trying to give Artsakh and of course Syunik as well. And we see that many roads in Syunik are already gone, and we know that Berdzor, they are already discussing to give up Berdzor, and we know that this so-called power just takes out from the Armenians' minds that Artsakh is Armenian.
Now let's step back a bit and try to analyze what some of this means. I think one of the reasons that these demonstrations are not actually larger than they are, frankly, is because of the lack of clarity of what is being negotiated or what is being talked about. And I think it's very hard for people to come out en masse and oppose something that, frankly, there's a lot of confusion about. And that over the last 2 weeks, the government has been consistently denying that there's any negotiations as far as final status of Artsakh is concerned. The second thing is, I think these demonstrations would be larger if it wasn't for the fact that it was being led by the current opposition, which frankly in perception still has the same perceptions it has for the last couple of years. So I would say these demonstrations actually underplay the unease that's out there in society about the government's position in its negotiations over the status of Artsakh. What the government needs to understand and really see this as a warning, and that is if you cross the red lines of Armenian society in regards to the Artsakh issue, which I think in the current time period is two things. One, the fact that the people in Artsakh should never live under the thumb of the Azeri regime. And two, the physical security of the people of Artsakh should not be compromised. If you come up with anything that crosses those red lines, these couple of thousand-person demonstrations will quickly turn into a couple of 100,000 demonstrations. And do not misunderstand the size of what's going on right now to what will happen if you cross those lines. As far as the opposition is concerned, what they need to understand is they do have the popular side of this issue. However, if people come to believe that their only purpose in being out in the streets is not the issue of Artsakh, it's actually to undo the revolution and 2 elections that they've lost, these will quickly peter out. If the opposition is serious about changing the government or having new elections or whatever that they want to achieve. One, they have to broaden their coalition to include people that supported this government before or supported the revolution but were against them. Two, have some introspection as far as admitting the mistakes that they have made over the years, which is, I know, culturally in Armenian politics is next to impossible. And not to appear to be opportunistic about this issue, given the relevance that it's important to Armenian society, and being very principled about it. Now I'm going to move on to our second topic of the week, which is noting the 50th edition of the show. And I want to have some reflections on the importance of the freedom of the press and freedom in general. When I was thinking about this week's show, I was thinking about a famous quote from the third American president, Thomas Jefferson, in which he said, if he ever has a choice between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he said, I should not hesitate in a moment to prefer the latter. And what he means by that is that the building blocks of any successful society, whether it's politically or economically, is actually basic freedoms. And there's nothing that denotes basic freedoms more than the freedom of the press, and a press that is not afraid to criticize not just people in political power, but essentially all powerful people in that society, and call them to account for their mistakes. As I was reflecting on what our show has meant, or what is it that we're able to do, I was actually in some ways astounded in the fact that here I am, I can get on broadcast on a weekly basis and criticize the government, criticize the opposition, criticize the defense minister, our intelligence services. And there's no one knocking on my door telling me what I can say, what I can't say, which for a political system in this part of the world is actually quite a remarkable achievement. For example, in the country to the east of us is actually one of the leading jailers of journalists in the world. And the family-run gas station to the west of us is actually the leading kidnapper of bloggers and a murderer of journalists from around the world. As I always like to note to our foreign visitors especially, is I always ask them to get a globe and take a globe, and you can draw a line between Armenia through the Caspian, through Central Asia, through China, and you would have to get to South Korea to have another country that enjoys the freedoms, the press freedoms that we have in this country. One of the recent things that happened, it was a report that came out this week from the Reporters Without Borders. Armenia itself climbed 12 places. We went from 63rd to the 51st freest press in the world. That's a climb of 12 places. They noted that there's 4 media outlets in Armenia, Azatachun, Factor AM, Het, and CIVILNET, that are independent outlets fulfilling their role as an essential counterweight to democracy. Obviously, not everyone agrees with this point of view in our part of the world, so I will have you listen to one of our regional leaders and what they had to say.
Великий Запад, богатый Запад, соли нет. И чтобы люди не говорили о том, что белорусы нормально живут, они их просто не выпускают. Вот и вся демократия. Ну, слава Богу, что у нас диктатура. Вы все меня критиковали. Диктатура, диктатура. Так зато порядок есть при этой диктатуре. Не было бы диктатуры, вот так ходили бы голодьбой.
That was Belarusian President Lukashenko, and with all due respect to him, most of the people living in rags around the world actually do live in dictatorships and not in free countries. When moving on to our neighboring country, Georgia, they actually dropped dramatically. They went from 60th place to 89th place. And in fact, last year, someone involved in the press was actually murdered in that country. Russia itself, our biggest northern neighbor, ranked 155th. And this year, I think those numbers, unfortunately, are going to get worse because almost all of opposition media is being shut down in that country, especially since the beginning of the war. And Aliyev's kingdom actually came in at 154th in its ranking in the world. However, it's important for us when looking at the importance of the freedom of the press not to see it as a limited thing, because freedom of the press, which is the basis of all freedoms, political freedoms, are actually the underpinnings of economic prosperity in most of the world. In most of the world, with the possible exception of China, freedom and prosperity are married together. So where you have freedom, you have much more likely to have a prosperous country, and the reverse is true. And there's actually no better example of that than the IT industry itself, which is what we have in Armenia. The IT industry is actually the only industry that can dramatically change our fortunes very quickly. There's not a single example of a totalitarian state having a startup culture or that atmosphere that is necessary to have a successful IT sector, for example, like we have now, and we're building it, every day that goes by. There's plenty of authoritarian states that have built fantastic parks, make offices available, try to attract IT people from around the world, and almost all of them have been dramatic failures. The reason for that is simple, because a startup culture or a successful knowledge economy and creating the atmosphere for it is predicated on having a free society. It is very hard to do societies that are not free. When trying to sort of understand this universally, I think we need to step back and understand the concept. What does freedom mean in the Armenian context? And which is freedom, that freedom culture narrative is really the underpinning of all of our political or economic progress that we can make. And freedom in the Armenian culture is somewhat different from a Western one. It's really about, it's not a negative freedom in the sense that Western freedom is always about things that the government can't do for you. Freedom in the Armenian context is about the ability to live freely with your own choices, but within solidarity. It's fair to say that Armenian culture is not particularly democratic. It's actually anti-authoritarian. That's what drives our democratic movements here, and not some very vague understanding of democracy or faith in it. In conclusion, what we think of freedom and whatever opportunities that we have in this country that others don't regionally, frankly, this is a result of struggle by hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, over long periods of time. Unfortunately, what history teaches us that the trees of liberty all around the world are unfortunately watered by the blood of martyrs that are willing to fight for them and to fight for the rights that we enjoy today. I hope whatever happens, we never dare to forget that fact and to forget those people. Thank you for joining me in this week's episodes of Insights.
Այրենի